sorry I left you, Lois.
I wish I could fly. I know I could save us somehow.
Will I see you around?
I'm always around.
Rated PG-13 in theaters and IMAX June 30th.
Comic book movies. When I say those words, chances are the first thing that pops into your head is a superhero of some sort. Comic book movies aren't exactly limited to stories about superheroes. Many of the best ones aren't about them. But one cannot deny that the popularity of superheroes within the medium has made them synonymous with one another. As of the past decade, we've seen an overabundance of these superhero-focused comic book adaptations. Some may argue too many, to the point where it's oversaturated Hollywood. That's not to say that superhero fatigue has finally set in. There's always going to be those special cases where a new film grosses well over its production costs, seemingly proving that the so-called fatigue is just a myth, until the next one bombs. With all that said, before Iron Man would introduce the cinematic universe concept in 2008, the early 2000s was a vastly different time for this genre. There appeared, at least on the surface, to be more of a focus on auteurism, with successful franchises like Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy and Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy. Not that we don't still get films like that today, some more recent examples being Matt Reeves' Batman and James Gunn's Guardians movies. Of course, auteurism isn't always a mark of quality. It can just as often result in a dud, depending on the filmmaker or the circumstances that they're put into. A lot of Warner Brothers' recent output more than proves this. But with these big studios like Disney and Warner Brothers having so much of a hold over the genre, I will say that a lot of comic book films released today are generally pretty safe, corporate mandated products. At least it seems more apparent now than ever. Studio interference is not some newfound concept and has unfortunately plagued creatives for generations.
If you've only seen the first part, you haven't seen the best part.
Still, the early 2000s was this fascinating time of these studios still trying to grasp what drove audiences to a comic book film. I think their limited understanding of comic books led to them relying more on the director's vision, many of which weren't even comic book fans themselves. And while films like Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy certainly helped crack the code, the output in terms of quality was, how you say, mixed. You'd either get something that felt like a more genuine attempt or a half-assed cash grab. One adaptation that proved to be quite successful while still doing sort of its own thing distinct from the comics was Bryan Singer's X-Men. Fresh off the success of 1995's The Usual Suspects, Singer, who was not a comic book fan, had agreed to do X-Men as he felt a strong connection to its themes of prejudice. The success of X-Men led to his work on its sequel, X2. During that time, Singer had pitched a story idea to X2 producer Lauren Shuler Donner, along with her husband, Richard Donner. Richard Donner being the director of the 1978 classic, Superman, if that weren't already obvious. His idea was received positively, but for a short while that's all it was, an idea. In 1987, Canon Films would release the blunderous Superman 4, A Quest for Peace. After this, Superman would experience a long hiatus while his parent studio, Warner Brothers, attempted to crack the code of how to bring back the Man of Steel in an exciting, fresh way. There were multiple attempts at rebooting the franchise, some of which came pretty close to being a reality. Tim Burton's infamous Superman Lives being one of them, a film with a troubled production that was cancelled when Warner Brothers deemed it simply too expensive. There was also a Wolfgang Peterson-directed Batman vs. Superman movie in development during the early 2000s. This only got so far before executives made the decision to fall back and focus on solo Superman and Batman projects. Those two films being Chris Nolan's Batman Begins and another reboot known as Superman Flyby. Superman Flyby is heavily attributed to J.J. Abrams, who, it should be noted, did not direct the film, but instead wrote its script. The film would have been directed by Mick G, who, based on his filmography, was probably not the best choice. From what I've read, it seems that Abrams himself really wanted to direct this film, and honestly, if they'd let him, I think it could have been something worthwhile. Before filming could begin, McG dropped out when Warner Brothers pushed to film in Sydney, Australia. He would cite later on that his reason for this was his fear of flying.
Ironic.
And this led Warner Brothers back to the drawing board as they sought out Bryan Singer to direct his take on the character. The plan? A continuation of Donner Superman that takes place after his 5-year absence. It was certainly an interesting idea to go with a continuation rather than a reboot, especially with Batman's reboot being right around the corner. But with the obvious case of Christopher Reeve's accident in the 90s and the fact that all the actors were significantly older now, a new set of actors would be cast in each of the iconic roles. The irony of this is that many of the potential choices included actors who would later go on to star in the DCEU, such as Henry Cavill and Amy Adams. Instead, they went with Brandon Routh, a mainly TV actor, as the titular hero, and Kate Bosworth as Lois Lane. Kevin Spacey, who had worked with Singer on The Usual Suspects, would be cast as Lex Luthor. This had always been the plan, as screenwriters Michael Dougherty and Dan Harris wrote the screenplay with him in mind. And at this moment, I think it's important I stop discussion of this film to address a very large elephant in the room, that being the multiple controversies surrounding both Bryan Singer and Kevin Spacey. So unless you've been living in a cave for the past decade, it's a well-known fact that both of them have been accused of sexual assault, specifically involving minors, on multiple occasions. This, of course, is awful, and I don't think you can ever discuss Singer or Spacey without feeling the need to bring this up. But as much as I'd like to, as people say, separate the art from the artist, I don't think that will ever be entirely possible, especially when a director's unique style is kind of all over the film. I'm not going to pretend the Singer had nothing to do with this movie, because without his direction, the film wouldn't even exist. But it should also be clear an endorsement of a film is not an endorsement of the director's or a cast member's actions. It's absolutely ridiculous that stuff like this was and still is allowed to happen in Hollywood. But the purpose of this video is not really to discuss that. I'd rather focus on the film itself. And if you do have any questions regarding these controversies, believe me, there are plenty of online resources that do a much better job at covering them than I ever could. Moving along, I feel it necessary to discuss my personal connection with the Man of Steel and what the character meant to me at an early age. To put it simply, I loved Superman as a kid. I loved all things superheroes. But my initial introduction to the character was via the DCAU cartoons that defined much of my childhood. I'm sure watching Smallville's later seasons around the age of 9 or 10 also played into it. But I would argue that that show nurtured my interest rather than started it. I think like most kids, my love for the character was more surface level. I loved the colorful costume and the idea of a character who was just so insanely powerful. As I grew older and read more comics, I've certainly grown to appreciate the character for his ideals, the creative storytelling that merges fun adventures with sci-fi and classic heroism, and the likable characters who surround him, like Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen. To me, they are just as essential to Superman as the character himself. Till this day, Superman is one of my favorite superheroes. He's like top 5 for sure, if we're counting the Ninja Turtles as one. Despite this, I tend to have little to no memory of the release of Superman Returns. I have no nostalgia for Superman Returns, which is weird considering I remember so much of the marketing around films like Raimi's Spider-Man sequels and the Tim Story Fantastic Four movies.
Now you can team up Star and Lightning Bolt chicken tenders with Fantastic Four toys.
Thanks, love 'em. Awesome!
But I don't recall any of that with Superman Returns, the one exception being a toy I owned based on the movie. In fact, until my recent decision to rewatch it, I had better memory of a parody scene in Epic Movie than the real thing.
It really hurts! Why would you do that? That was so unnecessary!
And it's not that I never bothered watching Superman Returns as a kid, because I did, probably just a few years after its theatrical release. Yet I struggled to remember what exactly happened in the movie. All I could remember was something about Lois Lane and her son on a boat with Lex, waiting for Superman to save them. But it's less the movie I recall, and more so the feeling associated with it, and that feeling being severe boredom. However, I didn't want my memory of something I watched as a kid to remain my definitive opinion on it. I was young and had a ways to go before I would start to recognize film as an art form. So with that in mind, I wanted to revisit this movie with an open mind to see if it's really as dull as I remember, or something worthwhile. So what exactly is Superman Returns about? Allow me to briefly summarize the entire plot of the movie. For those looking to avoid spoilers, I suggest you click off this video, but to be honest, there's really not too much you can spoil in this film. I believe most people who clicked on this video will have likely already seen it at some point in their life, so it's really up to you. The movie follows Superman's return to Earth 5 years after he left in hopes of finding surviving life amongst the newly discovered remains of Krypton. He returns unsuccessful. As far as why he was gone for so long and the exact details of his journey, it's all left extremely vague. It does raise a lot of questions, but to be honest, it doesn't really matter. It's just something that needed to happen so that the entire concept of this movie can exist. Supposedly, this film is a direct sequel to Superman 2, ignoring the events of 3 and 4, but there are some elements of it beyond the recasting that makes it feel closer to a reboot. It doesn't appear to be set in the 80s, which tends to confuse some people, but I like that they kept it modern, considering the people who watched Superman 1 and 2 in the 70s and 80s probably weren't thinking about their current time period while watching it. The film actually starts off with a fun opening credits sequence in which we zoom through space to the classic John Williams Superman theme. Although it should be noted that the film uses a mix of the classic score with new music by John Ottoman, who I feel does an excellent job, but more on him in a bit. As much as I enjoyed the opening credits, they do tend to feel misleading, as that fun, fast-paced vibe is not at all the tone of the rest of the film. After his return, Clark resumes his job at the Daily Planet, discovering that despite mankind's many struggles, the world has seemingly moved on without a Superman. To make matters worse, Lois Lane is now engaged to Perry White's nephew, Richard, who she shares a son with. Richard is played by James Marsden, who should really have a CG animal at his side. I can't get used to the sight of him without one. The scenes that take place at the Daily Planet are a lot of fun, and sort of the highlight of the movie for me. Everyone feels well cast, and it's some of the more lighthearted moments offered to us.
Hey, look who's back.
Kent,
Hey, Chief. Thank you for giving me my job back.
don't thank me. Thank Norm Palmer for dying.
It was his time.
Brandon Routh often gets criticized for lacking the charisma that Christopher Reeves had, with some critics claiming he was only cast for looking like him, which, yeah, was probably the case. But I would argue that he does a pretty good job at portraying both Clark and Superman, considering what little he had to work with. The film does have this ultra-serious, melodramatic tone, which, for the most part, is fine. I actually kinda love that about this movie, but it doesn't save a lot of room for the levity that Reeve brought to the role. Meanwhile, Lex Luthor schemes up another evil plan, as during Superman's absence, he was able to steal a Kryptonian crystal from the Fortress of Solitude. He requests that his henchman, Kumar, who presumably just escaped from Guantanamo Bay, to drop a piece of it into a pool of water. The crystal reacts violently, leading to a massive quake and power outage. The power outage ends up a bit of a problem for Lois, who happens to be on board an airplane that is currently attempting to launch a shuttle off its back into space. Say, what kind of plane is this anyway?
By piggybacking on this Boeing 777.
Oh, fuck! This leads to the film's first true appearance of the Man of Steel as he manages to safely land the plane, but not before its passengers can suffer some serious head trauma. I'd like to take this moment to discuss Superman's suit, because that seems to be a big topic of discussion these past few months. I see a lot of criticism for this costume, people saying the red is too dark or the symbol is too small. I agree with the latter. I think that S should be much bigger. But I think the colors are actually perfectly fine and look great given the film's darker tones. I also prefer the wider neckline of Reeves' costume to this one, which looks like it's choking him. But that aside, I quite admire the simplicity of it all. I've seen some people argue that the suit is over-designed, and I don't really understand what about this is over-designed. Oh my god. Yeah, so it turns out the S on the suit is made out of thousands of tiny S's. If that weren't crazy enough, you should see the bottom of the boots, which are just... what? I actually kind of love that about the suit. The fact that it's unnecessarily complex, but so subtle about it that it feels simple on the surface. It's truly something that only an insane person would think up. After the exciting airplane rescue, the world welcomes their savior's return as the Daily Planet goes back to solely printing news stories about Superman.
Sports? How are they going to get that plane out of the stadium? Travel? Where did he go? Was he on vacation? If so, where? Gossip? Has he met somebody? Fashion? Is that a new suit?
Lois stresses the significance of the power outage, which she feels needs to be covered, but Perry White ain't having none of that.
The story isn't the blackout. It's Superman.
From this point on, the story switches focus to more of this melodramatic drama, with Superman questioning his place in the world and wondering if he'll ever have a chance to be with Lois again. And in this part of the movie, it becomes quite clear to me why a kid would find this so boring. Especially when you consider the fast-paced comic book films of the time, like Raimi's Spider-Man. A movie that has plenty of drama, but is much better at keeping a consistent balance of the action and the more sentimental stuff. Of course, watching this now, I will say that these moments are some of the best in the movie. There's an earnestness to it all that's missing from a lot of modern comic book films. Despite the fantastical appearance of Superman, it all feels so grounded, and it really makes it easier to picture a world where Superman could exist. It's not just Superman, but Lois who gets a lot of screen time as well. I really admired how much of this film is about her. Her time on screen feels equivalent to Superman's, making her just as essential to the story. During these moments of the film, I found myself enamored by the cinematography. I think this is a beautifully shot movie without ever feeling too in your face. There's an art to the subtlety of it all. My favorite moment in the film is a loving tribute to the "Can You Read My Mind" flying sequence from the '78 film. Sure, it's nothing new, but you can tell this movie comes from a place of strong nostalgia for those films. There's a shot in which Superman and Lois fly in front of the Daily Planet globe, and it's easily one of my favorite images from any piece of Superman media. And it's all thanks to the cinematographer, Newton Thomas Sigel, best known for his work on Movie 43.
Will you poop on me?
What?
Okay, so he's done other stuff. The music really carries this scene too. Yes, it owes a lot to the John Williams score, but John Ottoman's use of these oohs and ahs really gives it an entirely new spin. With this film, there's this beautiful balance of practical and CG effects. The CG is used pretty sparingly, only in places where it makes the most sense. Whereas quite a bit of Superman's fight scenes are still accomplished via impressive wire work. There are some great shots in this film that really show off the majesty of Superman. One such example being the sorta Atlas Shrugged shot of Superman holding up the Daily Planet globe. The practical effects are done where it matters most. They really do so much of the film's heavy lifting. Pun fully intended. Hey, it was right there. It's not my fault. During an investigation of the power outages, Lois Lane, along with her son, who she brought with because, of course, finds themselves at the address of a huge yacht, which they happen to invite themselves into. This does result in a pretty hilarious moment of shocking revelation.
I like the curly one.
So of course Lois and her son find themselves trapped in Lex Luthor's yacht, as the rule of every Superman movie states that a damsel, specifically Lois, must be in distress. And I must state that despite Kevin Spacey being who he is still unfortunately a good actor, and he does a terrific job in the role of Lex Luthor. I think that he and Sam Huntington as Jimmy Olsen are really the two giving the most fun to watch performances. They really do add at least a little bit of levity to an otherwise less than exciting and pretty dour film. With Lois and her son Jason, I think this is the first time I've said his name, held hostage on the boat, Lex takes the opportunity to reveal his evil plan to use the crystals to sink half the US, killing billions, in order to form a new continent that he can sell as land.
You used me for land development.
As the forming of the landmass occurs, chaos ensues across the globe as Superman struggles to protect the people of Metropolis while racing to save Lois and Jason. Which may sound exciting, but I assure you, it is not. This is really where the movie begins to fall apart for me, as around this part in the film, I made the rookie mistake of checking the runtime, assuming we were close to wrapping things up, only to realize that there was still an entire hour left. Lois is threatened by one of Lex's henchmen, but her son manages to save her by chucking a piano across the room like some sort of Looney Tunes character, which of course implies that Jason was Clark's son all along. Lois and Jason are thrown into a storage room and left for dead as the ship begins to sink. Oh yeah, and James Marsden shows up to drown with them, but I'll address that in a bit. I think in any other comic book movie, these sequences would be the most exciting part of the film. But Superman Returns has more of this focus on spectacle than on action that often results in a film that is unfortunately a bit of a bore. Not that a moment like this couldn't have been exciting, there's no reason that watching a mother and son almost drown should be boring, but I think there's just so much unnecessary footage that should have been left on the cutting room floor. Sequences like this did not need to be as long as they are, and stretching it out does not have the desired effect that Singer intended. Supposedly, Singer pushed for Warner Brothers not to waste their time with test screenings, and I can't help but feel that that was a huge mistake. I'm usually the type of person that's all for creative freedom. I believe that a film's director should be allowed to tell the story in a way that they see fit, preferably with as little studio feedback as possible. And supposedly there was about 15 minutes of the film cut out due to the suggestions of some of Singer's peers, but by God, did this movie need more time in the editing room. Sometimes a bit of creative input is actually a plus, especially when you're putting together a Hollywood summer blockbuster with the intention of appeasing a mass audience. Directors, even with a clear vision, can still have bad ideas. Like, the original Star Wars may be a masterpiece, but George, maybe don't insert those goofy-ass CG characters into your remaster. Just a suggestion. As already mentioned, Richard shows up via his trusty airplane, ready to save the day. Of course, only to be shown up by Superman.
Give me your hand.
Superman then confronts Lex only to realize the kryptonite-filled landmass he is standing on has left him in a weakened state.
Didn't your dad ever teach you to before you leave?
You piece of dirt. No, I'm wrong. You're lower than dirt. You're an ant!
Stabbed by kryptonite, Superman nearly drowns before Lois is able to convince Richard to take them back to save him. Pulling the crypto knife, that's what I'm calling it, from his side, Superman uses one last burst of energy to fly above the clouds, absorbing the rays of Red's sun. He then uses his newfound strength to heave the kryptonite-filled rock upwards into space. And some of you may be wondering, how is this possible? Clearly, with all of the kryptonite, he shouldn't be able to lift this thing at all, let alone fly. And if I'm being completely honest here, by this point, I just couldn't bring myself to care. The Richard Donner films had all sorts of weird leaps in logic too. It's really not that far-fetched for a Superman story to make little to no sense, and I say that as a Superman fan. Using the last of his strength to toss the rock, our hero hurtles towards Earth, striking the ground and falling into a coma. Fortunately for me, the film goes back to the melodrama for the final 20 minutes, which is actually the stuff that I like in this movie. Superman recovers miraculously and visits his son while he sleeps, saying the words that his father, Jor-El, once spoke to him.
The son becomes the father, and the father becomes the son.
He meets Lois outside, reassuring her that he'll be around, before flying amongst the stars in one last tribute to Donner's Superman films. Superman Returns is a movie that I wanted to like. There's certainly a lot of stuff I do really like about it, and I think it comes from a place of sincere respect for the character, but it's also a film I can't see myself ever bothering to rewatch. If it weren't for that last hour being such a slog, I would definitely recommend it, but I think this is a movie only Superman fans will have much, if any, interest in checking out. Despite this, I do think the reception it has received today is a little unfair. It appears to be often forgotten, and after watching it again, I can understand why. With a bad film, there would at least be a lot to discuss, but with Superman Returns being pretty okay, I don't have too much to criticize, and there's only so many ways you can call something boring. But still, the stuff that works does really work. I think Singer's strength was the more grounded drama, and it all comes off as genuine. Obviously, a lot of the hate that this film receives is due to the controversial people that surround it, and I fully get that. But it is strange to me how much the general public's response to this film has changed in the course of about 2 decades. When the film first released in 2006, it was pretty highly regarded. It wasn't hailed as a masterpiece by any means, but most of the reviews from critics were positive, and audiences seemed to like it too. Well, at least according to CinemaScore, if that counts for anything. The film managed to make more than its budget back, almost double that of the $204 million it cost to make, but Warner Brothers still felt it underperformed. Just goes to show there's really no pleasing corporate Hollywood. I do believe a lot of the modern hate for this movie comes from a place of contempt for the filmmaker, but I also strongly believe that even if those events had never occurred, Bryan Singer would probably still be known as the X-Men guy, and Superman Returns would still be mostly forgotten. At one point there were talks of a sequel with more focus on action, but I think Warner Brothers made the right choice by rebooting it with Man of Steel instead. Okay, maybe greenlighting Man of Steel wasn't the right choice, but at least it was a step in the right direction. Or at least felt like it at the time.
Only the spark of a god can restore its power. And there are no gods left.
There is one.
Currently, James Gunn is hard at work on yet another take on Superman. Not too much is known about it as of the making of this video. They did reveal the costume while I was putting this together, which is pretty ugly in my opinion. Quick update. A bunch of set photos got leaked while I was editing this video, and I've sort of come around to it. I still think the extra lines are completely unnecessary, but I do love the bright colors. It really makes it feel like it's straight out of a comic. But I think it's safe to assume that this version of Superman will be less preachy and closer to the more fun, lighthearted sci-fi adventures of the comics. I am actually really looking forward to it, and hoping that Warner Brothers can manage to put together a cinematic universe that makes any bit of coherent sense. But who am I kidding? I just want to take this moment to thank everyone who watched this video, as well as any of my other videos. It really means a lot, and I love that I get enough support to make my time spent on these videos feel worthwhile. I usually stick to cartoons, and I do still plan to do that, but sometimes it's fun to break the mold and talk about something else I have a deep love for, like Superman. Anyway, thanks again, and I hope you're all doing well. Take care, and goodbye.